A skeleton buried 40,000 years ago was found wearing hundreds of hand-carved beads, its body arranged with more care than most funerals today. Your ancestors were not grunting brutes. They were something far stranger and far more like you than you have ever been told. You have seen the image 1,000 times, a hunched, hairy figure dragging a club, mumbling in grunts, dragging a woman by her hair toward a cave. That image feels ancient, it feels obvious, it feels true. But almost none of it is. Where did that picture even come from? Not from bones, not from tools. It came from a courtroom sketch, a cartoon, and a single mistaken skeleton over 100 years ago. And once that image existed, it never left. In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was unearthed near La Chapelle aux Saints in France. A French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule studied the bones and reconstructed the posture. He drew a stooped, ape-like creature with a jutting jaw and a shuffling gait. Newspapers loved it. Illustrators copied it. That single reconstruction became the template for every caveman cartoon that followed. There was just one problem. The skeleton belonged to an elderly individual who had severe arthritis and had lost most of his teeth. Boule was not looking at a typical Neanderthal. He was looking at an old, sick man, and he mistook illness for species. Decades later, when researchers re-examined the bones, they found what the original study missed entirely. A healthy Neanderthal stood upright, walked efficiently, and had a brain that was, on average, slightly larger than yours. Let that sit for a second. Larger. So if the posture was wrong, what about the intelligence? This is where the real story gets strange, because the evidence that has surfaced over the last 20 years does not just correct the old picture, it dismantles it. Start with fire. You probably picture early humans huddled around a lucky spark, terrified of the flames. But archaeologist Will Robrooks, who has spent years excavating Neanderthal sites across Europe, found something else. Evidence at sites in France and the Netherlands suggests Neanderthals were not just using fire, they were manufacturing a birch bark adhesive through a controlled heating process, one that requires maintaining a precise temperature range for an extended period. Miss that range, and the substance burns to ash instead of becoming glue. This was not an accident. It was chemistry, performed by firelight, by people you were taught could barely speak. And that brings you to the next assumption you probably carry. Language. For most of the 20th century, the story was simple. Early humans could not truly speak. Their throats were shaped wrong. Their thoughts were too simple to need words. But in 1983, excavators in Israel uncovered a Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small floating bone in your throat that anchors your tongue and voice box. It was nearly identical to yours. Not similar, nearly identical. Anatomically, there was no barrier to complex speech. But wait, if Neanderthals could think and speak and build fires this precisely, how did they ever handle something as basic as finding food without agriculture, without maps, without writing anything down? The answer might be the most counterintuitive part of this entire story. They handled it better than most modern humans could. Archaeologist Rebecca Ragg-Sykes, who has spent her career piecing together Neanderthal daily life, describes communities that tracked animal migration patterns across seasons, understood plant medicine, and passed down complex, multi-step tool-making knowledge through direct teaching. At a site in Iraq, researchers found a Neanderthal skeleton, nicknamed Shanidar 1, who had survived a crushed arm, partial blindness, and severe hearing loss for years before eventually dying of natural causes. In a world without medicine as you know it, someone that disabled does not survive alone. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone chose, again and again, to keep him alive. That is not the behavior of a brute. That is the behavior of a society. Now push further back, past the Neanderthals, to the humans who were supposedly still catching up. Homo sapiens, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before anything you would call civilization. You were probably taught that art began with cave paintings, simple outlines of bison and horses scratched onto stone walls. Impressive for the time, but primitive. Except that framing quietly hides something enormous. Researcher Genevieve von Petzinger spent years cataloging markings inside European caves that are not animals at all. Dots, lines, zigzags, grids, hand stencils, repeated across hundreds of sites separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. The same symbols, over and over. That repetition is not random doodling. It suggests a shared visual language, understood across generations, across regions, long before any written alphabet existed. Think about what that actually means. Symbols that meant the same thing to different groups, in different caves, in different centuries, imply teaching. implies memory passed forward on purpose, implies your ancestors were not slowly stumbling toward meaning. They already had it. So why does the brutish version still feel true even now, even after all of this? Partly because it is simple, and simple stories spread faster than complicated ones. Partly because Boole's sketch became the visual shorthand every cartoonist since has copied without question. But mostly because believing your ancestors were primitive makes you feel like progress is a straight line, climbing steadily upward, with you standing comfortably at the top. The evidence suggests something less flattering and far more interesting. Progress was not a line. It was a scattered, uneven accumulation of knowledge, lost and rediscovered, carried by people whose inner lives were every bit as rich as yours. Consider the burial you heard about at the very start, the one with hundreds of carved beads. That grave belonged to a teenager, buried roughly 34,000 years ago at a site called Sumhir in Russia, alongside an even younger child, both covered in thousands of painstakingly crafted ivory beads that anthropologists estimate would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labor to produce. Thousands of hours, spent on two children who could not have contributed that labor themselves. That is not survival behavior. That is grief. That is love, expressed in the only permanent language available at the time. When you picture a caveman now, picture that instead. Not a grunting silhouette dragging a club. A person who mourned, who taught, who cared for the sick, who built tools with real chemistry, who painted symbols meant to be understood by strangers not yet born. The distance between you and them was never about intelligence. It was time and circumstance and the tools each of you happened to inherit. Strip away the technology, and the mind underneath was already, unmistakably, like your own. That is the real answer, not that they were less than you imagined, that they were almost exactly what you already are, dressed differently, standing at an earlier point on the same unbroken line.